This is Ilana Stockman, co-host of the Women Ending War podcast. We've been having great conversations with women changing the world in many areas, not just around peace in the Middle East. Here is some bonus content for our listeners and followers. A wonderful conversation with brilliant and dedicated Sara Shapiro-Plevan, founder of the Gender Equity and Hiring Project. We talk gender, culture, money, Jewish life, and the many challenges women face, especially in our difficult world. Take a listen. Hello, Sarah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good afternoon.
It's my afternoon,
Good
this morning.
afternoon.
I'm so happy to be here with you today chatting. Sara Shapiro-Plevan, founder of the Gender Equity in Hiring Project, an amazing, outstanding, so necessary organization that announced this week, that you're sunsetting, closing. And I'm sad.
Indeed.
I'm really, really sad. So
Thank you. Thank you. It's a real moment of transition for us. And I think this represents in lots of ways, not just our like personal feelings about all of the issues of the moment, but a real feeling of, as you said just a few moments ago, sadness about sort of the broader scheme of things, right? Transitions that we're all making.
yeah.
So,
But first, let's take a minute to celebrate what you've done,
yeah.
because you have had some outstanding accomplishments, really changing real life practices as well as cultures and communal discourse. So let's start from the beginning. Okay, tell us about the project, the organization.
So we were founded really on the heels of the birth of the Me Too movement in the United States. There was a stirring, beautiful, very complicated gathering hosted by the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York, and it was called Gamani, the Hebrew for Me Too. And following that event, which was really a storytelling experience, we noticed that folks were really grounded in this idea that it was super necessary to tell stories, but at the same time, we were holding the awareness that there wasn't yet a move to action, right? We're going to hear these stories and there wasn't an and then. And this work was really born out of the and then, right? What happens next? That really motivated us to capture and listen to those stories and invite the question, what can we do about this, right? What can we, just, a handful of people working across the Jewish community, what might we actually be able to do to make a shift so that some of these things that we're hearing about in these terrible stories of abuse of power, of sexual harassment, gender harassment, might be able to prevent into the future. And that was really the very beginning.
Can I just say that it's so amazing, just that in itself. I just want to point out how amazing it is, first of all, to have that kind of public expression of what's happening, which was a real gift of the Me Too movement. But also, what I really value, one of the things that I really value in what you're putting out here, is the connection between these things, that the connection between sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and just general gender abuse and mistreatment of women in the workplace. Not all sexual harassment is male on female. There's lots of different versions of it.
Absolutely.
But there's a particular thing about the way women are often treated that's connected here. And I'm so grateful to you for putting those connections together. Yeah.
And thank you for the thank you. What I'll say is that from the very beginning, while we looked at this as an opportunity to help women and people of all genders rise to positions of leadership, we recognized that what was holding those folks back was not exclusively in the domain of abuse by men, right? Because we know that it is people of all genders in positions of power who abuse, whether that is physical abuse or emotional abuse or abuses of power. And let me also be bold. that we couldn't get this work done without the loud, active, and passionate voices of male allies. So there has not been a time from the very beginning of this work that women have been asked to do this work alone. Women and non binary folks, we wanted to make sure that our tent included folks of all genders. Um, and really, that we are working together with as many folks as possible to challenge the way that gender bias shows up at work as the foundation to make sure that we can move toward change.
So as opposed to other people who hear this stuff and like nod along, like I'm nodding along now, you didn't just nod along. You picked yourself up and said, I'm going to do something. And you did something really big. You, Sara Shapiro-Plevan. Yes. So tell us what you did.
I was very fortunate to be able to do this, in part because I had come from a background in organizational consulting. I'd spent the previous number of years in the space of organizational consulting, and I understood that it was possible to take the moment and use folks' reaction, concern, and anxiety as a lever for change, right? When we look at a particular moment, we can see it either as an opportunity for storytelling and then departure, or as an opportunity to make change inside our organizations. And I'm very fortunate to have that background, and also a background that really relies on seeing the world through a networked lens, that we are all connected, and that because of those connections, we have at our disposal the world of resources around us.
Which, by the way, is also
By virtue of
gendered. Like women are not
yeah,
always, socialized into
exactly.
understanding our networks and using our networks and pulling each other up and pulling ourselves up through leverage. We are not trained in that as a rule.
We are not trained in it, except we are highly relational people.
Yes.
Women
Yes.
are, from the earliest times, we did not go out into the world to hunt the woolly mammoths. We stayed with our people around the fire and cared for each other.
Mm.
And when we leverage those kinds of relationships, we know that we go further faster together.
Cool. That's awesome. That's really awesome. I love that. Okay, so what did you do? What did you build here?
We started by identifying that the place we might be able to make change would be inside Jewish organizations that really noted the need for change. Maybe they were having trouble hiring a CEO or hiring a senior level employee, and that we might be able to get in there, right? To work with, whether it was the board or whether it was senior leadership, we might be able to get in and work with them to help them to spot and notice where they themselves were struggling with gender in the hiring process. What we noticed pretty quickly was that struggling with gender in the hiring process was not actually where we wanted to go. We really wanted to focus on bias in the hiring process, because bias is really the way that our brains work, right? It is both good and bad. It can work for us and against us. Sometimes it keeps us safe, sometimes it really doesn't. But it is the way that healthy brains work. We are naturally biased people, and we just want to make sure we use our biases positively and reflect on them in a way that is healthy. Um, and we wanted to go after working with senior organizational partners and boards. But what we discovered also there was that those folks are the most risk averse in any organizational system, right? The CEOs, wow, super risk averse, of course, which, like, okay, we get it. And the board's also super risk averse. So we shifted immediately from working with the boards and the C suite to working with mid level folks. And we shifted immediately away from just gender alone to working around gender and bias, so that we could really make sure that we were covering all of our bases through a bias lens and helping folks to really identify what best would serve their organizations through that lens.
So it's amazing actually, because like DEI is seen as something that like somehow makes things unfair, whereas what it's doing is repairing the unfairness, right? Instead of, it's like
Exactly.
I saw someone wrote something about that. It's not about saying like, oh, some less qualified woman or woman of color or person of color is now going to get the jobs. It's like, no, it's the opposite. It's we're trying to make sure that the less qualified white male is not getting all the privileges and benefits just because of how they look. Like we're trying to repair
Yep.
that and repair the unconscious bias, like all of that unconscious bias. And somehow that
Yep.
became like a, I don't know. Anyway, okay. Yeah. Okay.
I will say that we have only ever worked squarely in the place of equity, right? Not diversity and not inclusion. And I really want to really give the appropriate appreciation and respect to my colleagues who work in the diversity and inclusion spaces. Um, in the Jewish community, we have the privilege of working around the rubric of safety, respect, and equity. We have colleagues who have done work in the safety and respect spaces, right? Around workplace culture, which has bumped up against some of the work that we do, of course, because there's some natural overlap, and the safety place of really the issue of the protection of children and the the necessary attention paid to punishing the folks who do not appropriately um, the folks who have perpetrated crimes against children and adults as well. But we work squarely in that equity space with a recognition that equity is really not about fairness. It's not about giving an equal portion to everyone. It's about making sure that folks who have not been able to access the portion that they need
And deserve.
are able to ultimately and deserve, right? That they're able to access the portion that they need,
Yeah.
whatever that is,
Yeah.
to get the attention, the time, the support, the energy, whatever it is that they need, and that it is really about the allocation of resources inside our systems to make sure that the people who need the benefit of our system get the right benefit.
So tell us about your accomplishments, your many accomplishments. Like, let's brag.
Um,
Yeah.
so, we've had the pleasure of really working in a very responsive way. We set out some organizational goals from the beginning. And those organizational goals from the beginning were not things ultimately that we could either accomplish or meet, right? We wanted to see, for example, that every hiring committee would meet a threshold of 50% female identified folks on their hiring committees. Okay, that's really nice, but that's difficult for a teeny tiny organization to monitor and to enforce. So, okay, great. And by the way, very hard to actually like to get there always. Um, so we decided to sort of shift gears a little bit and to think about what it might mean to have some broader goals, but also to be more responsive to issues and needs as they came up across the community. So I'll give you a couple of big examples. There were some really interesting moments in the broader American cultural space where folks got really enthusiastic about talking about money. Really exciting. The first and I think biggest example, and this wasn't the first, but it was the loudest and biggest, was when the Washington Post newsroom, so the folks who worked in the newsroom, started to organize around salary after they had discovered that there were folks in the newsroom, right? We're not talking about folks in the field. We're not talking about the op-ed writers. We're not talking about the editors. Folks in the newsroom were making vastly different salaries for their work. And how did they discover this? Because they talked about it, right? It wasn't a secret. We don't know how, but whether it was, at lunch, passing in the hall, at the water cooler, somebody opened up a spreadsheet, who knows, a Google Doc, Excel, whatever it was, and said, hey, we're going to make some columns. put in your data, it's going to be anonymous. And they did. And what they discovered was that the middle-aged white men and the middle-aged white women were not making the same amount. The people with the same qualifications and the same background and the same experience were not making the same amount of money. Now, this does not only serve for gender, this also serves for people of color, serves for LGBTQ folks. What we notice is that we hold certain biases when it comes to pay. And we have, and I say we very broadly, we have this belief that men are breadwinners and that they should be responsible for their families. And so we pay them more. Sometimes we don't even know it because we haven't developed criteria that help us to structure their pay.
But it's not just
Well,
about
that shows
being breadwinners. I mean, what's coming out now is that there's like a deep inherent belief that white men are like just automatically better at stuff, automatically
right.
smarter, automatically better. I mean, it's a really deep seated thing, automatically more deserving, assumed to be smarter. Like you just see the picture, you see a picture of a white man and you see a picture of a woman of color, and assumptions for men and women and people are, oh yeah, the man, obviously he's smarter, obviously he's more experienced, obviously he knows stuff. I mean, right? Am I wrong?
So back in the day, just a few months ago, we believed differently. And the spreadsheet, the one that we created, right? We uploaded a Google Doc and said, hey, people, fill your stuff in. Um, enabled people not just to share their information, but to toggle that with images of those white dudes, right? And to say, oh, okay, here's what I'm worth and here's what you're worth, but I have the exact same set of qualifications. So how is it that you pay that white dude differently than you pay me? So the first iteration of that spreadsheet was fascinating. We had about 1% of the entire Jewish workforce that contributed.
How much?
So the Jewish workforce in the United States is estimated, depending on when, right, pre-pandemic, was estimated to be about 70,000 people. And in the 1 month, we had over 700 people contribute their data. What we found was that data hit right at the middle. We had some people at the very bottom rung of our organizations participate, but not a ton. And we had almost no people in the C-suite participate. Why? Well, at the bottom rung, let's say entry level folks, I think that they felt that the data that they contributed would be less useful. At the top, what we know, because I heard directly from these folks, was that they were afraid that the data that they entered would not be appropriately anonymous to cover their bases, that they would be somehow identifiable.
And also
So
probably
what we
seen as participating in the inequity, maybe not also not wanting to be exposed for, you know,
possibly, absolutely, although it was anonymous,
yeah,
right? In theory.
theory.
So when you have somebody who's really an only in a role, you might share enough information that identifies that person. One of the most powerful conversations that I like to talk about in this work was the person who called me up and said, I can't possibly participate because the moment I enter my information, it will be completely obvious to me that I am a white dude in a field of women, and I am being paid in some cases $100,000 more than the equally qualified women who are doing the same job. Now, this is a fantastic human being, super bright, super capable, and just happened to get a great job. And I said to him, actually, that's precisely the reason I need you to contribute, because I need everybody else to see that it is possible to reach that height, right? You are making the highest level, and I need you to be the person who brings everybody up to you. By sharing your data, you enable people to see that as a goal.
Wow.
And ultimately he did.
Wow.
Actually, not ultimately, it was relatively quickly. And I always feel like I owe a real debt of gratitude to him for his contribution in that round, in part because every other person in his field can now look to that number, those benefits, et cetera, and say, oh, well, if he makes that based on my criteria, I should be making this. So that open spreadsheet, we did that for a month. 1 month, it was open for 1 month in the fall of 2019. And obviously, we know that 2020 brought us something very different. We were planning to take it and to revise it and to do something very different with it beginning in 2020. We did not get to do that right away. It took us quite a while. But we now have a beautiful version of it on our website that is far more sophisticated, far more user friendly, far more data friendly, which makes a huge difference. It will remain in perpetuity on our website for folks to enter data into. And what we know, certainly in the United States, and this is again only for the United States, um, is that salaries have not changed a lot in the last 15 years, right? We know that costs have changed, right? There's certainly inflation. Prices have changed. The price of eggs is something that everybody seems to be talking about. And at the same time, salaries really have not shifted radically. Salaries have not increased over X number of years. So we know that the data that is contained within that spreadsheet is still useful for folks. Useful in two ways. First, it's useful for people who are benchmarking and analyzing their salaries, salary offers, either in current jobs or in jobs that they're negotiating for. But it's also useful for employers. And we know that a lot of employers use it in order to set salaries, but also to make sure that the salaries that they're negotiating with potential employees are actually, roughly speaking, accurate.
So that's amazing. So you created this database, and you're saying the database is going to be available in perpetuity.
For
Amazing.
as long as we can open.
And
Yeah.
you're saying that you see real
Mhm.
changes in facts on the ground in people's real lives, and also in perceptions. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really quite remarkable. And I think that part of this is about the availability of data, right? We know that in the nonprofit space in general, there are plenty of databases, often geographically based or by sector, that enable people to search salary information. This is, something you can buy a subscription to out of the HR space. That is a very easy and basic way to benchmark salary. Project managers in nonprofits make X in
Yeah.
statewide with the following sets of benefits.
Yeah.
Those are really general.
Yeah.
The Jewish community is highly specific. I often like to talk about the titles that we use in the Jewish community as Harry Potter-esque titles. We like to come up with you know, um, director of magical potions and enrollment. I mean, the titles that we make up are often very silly and very hard to compare one to another. We also, by the way, I had the pleasure of learning this from a dear colleague. We often do things that take one portfolio and another portfolio and smush them together in order to maximize people's, I'll pretend, talents, but really that are, he taught me that this is called frankenjobbing, taking two jobs and sewing them together in order to maximize individual talent, hiring one person to do the job of two people. So we see
Well, it's
that
saving
quite a
money
bit,
on
and that
people's backs. I mean, it's saving money
exactly,
by like exploiting people and like running them
exactly.
till they can't breathe, basically.
Often two very different skill sets.
Mhm.
And so often what we see is, it's hard to compare one position to another. We're not all, for example, rabbis, right? Relatively speaking, and I say relatively speaking, easy to compare one to another. But even within that category, tremendous variations.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that the first step here is sharing information, is like getting rid of the taboos and getting rid of all of that secrecy, which is interesting because, in my previous book on sexual abuse in the Jewish community, I also found that the secrecy thing
Mhm.
really was
Yeah.
huge. Once you break down the walls of secrecy, a lot of things can happen. And it takes a lot of like people being willing and to say, okay, we need to talk about this. It's so interesting that you're saying that like money is even in some ways like a bigger taboo, a more lasting taboo than sexual abuse was. Like we were unpacking sexual abuse before we started unpacking money. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, look, one of the things that I learned very early on was that taboo around abuse in workplaces. Shh, right? We don't talk about this. We let those people stick around, we promote them. Okay, so once we started to lift up those conversations, what are the other things that are really hard for us to talk about? And what's very clear to me is that, in addition to a whole handful of other things, it's not just this, we are really uncomfortable talking about money. We are really uncomfortable talking about money. And worst of all, women are uncomfortable talking about money. We are uncomfortable naming what we are worth. And we're good at advocating for other people, right? Alana, if you came to me and said, I need some help negotiating my next contract, can you look it over for me? Can you make some recommendations? I would say 100% yes, I can help you with this, this, and this. And I would cheer you on, because women are really great at advocating for other people. This is called other advocacy, and it's grounded in research. We know we are really good at cheering other people on. We're really bad at doing this for ourselves. So when it comes to taboos around money, we believe that we can't. We are socialized to feel anxious and awkward and overly grateful in places where we do not need to feel grateful because we are super talented. We are deeply immersed in the idea that we sound, forgive me, bitchy or catty or difficult when we ask for money. We worry that we are unlikable, we are overly assertive, we are too bold when we make those asks, when in fact, everyone negotiates at every time throughout their lives, people of all genders, all ages, etc. And we fail to make the links between what we learned as negotiators in our very young childhoods. We fail to capitalize on that and turn that into something that we can use as adults. Um, you have beautiful children. You know that children and grandchildren, little kids learn to negotiate with their people very early on.
That's true.
Um, I am not going to eat those vegetables. I am not going to go to sleep. I am not going to take a nap. I'm going to do this, this, and this. And that is the process of negotiation. Um, Adult women, when they are invited to negotiate around money, often come to say, I don't have any experience negotiating, when they have negotiated their entire lives as humans, as parents, as children, and they fail to notice that they can capitalize on their capacity to negotiate, their gifts around negotiation, and use those to leverage more equitable pay.
Wow. I think also speaking sort of like personally, like I think that we also as women often get like punished, sort of subtly punished
Hmm.
for daring to ask.
Or not so subtly.
Well, not so subtle, exactly. We get punished. We get called names. We get isolated. Like a lot of things that you described. When we dare to stand on our needs, or when we dare to not be perky, if we dare turn off the smile and speak like seriously and firmly and authoritatively, then it's like, oh, why are you yelling? Well, like, what's wrong with you? Or, if you want me to help you, then you have to learn how to speak differently. Oh my God. I just had something like this the other day. Like, oh, whatever. I'm not even going to talk about the story. I do
Yeah.
want to.
Well, you have identified a really important point, though. A well researched theme in issues surrounding gender in the workplace, that women are seen as either assertive or warm, that you can't be
Can't be
both,
both. Can't be
right?
both
And
leadership
that
and likable. Can't be both a leader and confident and also like we like you.
and that, that people don't want us to be leaders. They don't want us to be assertive and bold. They want
Yeah.
us to be warm and friendly.
Yeah.
And that's not just women, right? Women want other women to be that way as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
We want our women to be soft and compliant and gentle, and that's how we want our women as leaders.
Yeah.
And when we see them bold and assertive, we're intimidated by
Yeah.
them.
So let's go back to talking about your accomplishments. So you have put some dents into all of this. You have, okay, the work isn't done, but you have definitely changed cultures. You can see it online. You can see, like, in conversations online about money, you could see with all kinds of initiatives popping up, women talking about money and talking, there's definitely a shift happening in certain places, in certain Facebook groups, for example. You can't advertise jobs
Mhm.
unless you say the salary. You can't talk about it without mentioning salary. So things like that are happening. What are some of the things you're most proud of? From how long was the organization open?
Will be 7 years.
Okay.
And I'll say that that is really something I'm really super proud of. The ability to shift those conversations has been a tremendous accomplishment for us. But I would be remiss in talking about that accomplishment were I not to talk about the air that we breathe and the sort of prevailing cultural winds in the United States right now. We began those conversations thanks to really just some queries in online spaces when folks would share job postings. Just, like I have a job posting, it's at my organization, come work with me. And folks would secretly, very quietly, and these are, Facebook groups that are mostly women, female identified Jewish professionals, all, not exclusively, but mostly. They would say, I see everything here except salary or salary or benefits. I'd be very interested in this, but I can't possibly apply for this job unless I know what the salary is. Or I'd really like to not waste their time because I need to make $100,000. And if this job pays $50,000, I'm not going to waste my time. So what we discovered was that it was possible to ask and to formulate those asks, not in ways that are offensive and nasty. Like, Alana, why didn't you put the salary on there? That's so ridiculous. You should have known better, which is obnoxious and doesn't get us where we need to go. But to teach people how to query from a place of curiosity, right? To be able to say to somebody who posts a job description or job posting, um, I noticed that there was no salary listed. Could you tell me a little bit more about why that is? Now, by and large, what shifted in folks was the ability to ask and the ability to answer, right? So the boldness that it takes to ask is a really big deal, whether you are advocating for yourself or you're advocating for other people. Um, and the ability to answer is also a really big deal because the people who post that stuff online are not usually the people who are writing them.
Interesting.
And then you have to go back, you have to circle back to your HR manager or to the person who wrote the job description and say, hey, you know, I'm in this community online. I think that they'd be a great asset for sharing this. But I'm told that I can't because there's no salary listed. Can you help me with that? And what we discovered was that we were able to identify people inside organizations, again, not at the senior level, but somewhere in the middle, who were willing to ask those questions of the people that they work with. Not everybody, but with the right kind of support, with the formulation of the right kinds of questions, people were able to go back to their employers and to say, or to colleagues in another organization and say, hey, why is this? And can I help you to make this different? Now, at the same time, I think it's important to note
That's
that
fantastic, by
there
the
were
way.
a
I just want
number.
to just say that is fantastic.
It's great,
Yeah.
exciting, and I
Yeah.
think part of what it is was helping people to decrease their anxiety
Hmm.
around what they perceived as a confrontation, and to learn how to, forgive me for saying this, but how to ask nicely, right? How to ask in a way that would actually get them results, in a way that was reflective and thoughtful and not aggressive, right? We know that by and large, asking for data, for information, for whatever, like asking for a favor, when we do it in a way that is aggressive or inconsistent with our values and beliefs, even if it's harnessing our feelings in the moment, we're less likely to get what we need. If we pause for a minute, just simply reflect on the ways in which the folks who are listening and receiving will best be able to hear what we have to say, we're likely to actually get more out of them. So formulating, and we actually have this on our website, formulating a series of ways to make an ask. It's actually a really powerful way of giving folks tools to get the job done, right? It's not just that they need the information. They also need to learn the skills for asking, which is a big deal. Um, we were able to capitalize on shifts in state law, local and state law. Um, Around the time that we got started with this, there were emerging bills in cities and states, New York City, where I live, being one of them, that brought to the fore the issue of pay transparency, and most especially things like listing a salary range on a job posting or inviting internal candidates to be able to query that information. Um, and Over time, a number of laws have been passed either in cities or localities. Some of them are by county, or in states around salary range transparency, whether that is posting a salary range for a position externally or internally, or making data available on salaries from the organization, from the business.
So that's great. So you have a whole range of like presents that you're leaving with us after you close, right? You're going to have the website up and you have all of these resources, the data, the ability to even add more data, resources to help people in their negotiations and all of that. That's amazing. What's the website, by the way? You want to share your URL?
The website is www.genderequityinhiringproject.org. It is long and unwieldy, but
Very
accurate.
accurate, very descriptive. It's exactly what you are. That's fantastic.
Exactly.
So you're leaving with really a lot to show for it, but the work is not exactly done, and you're leaving
It is not.
in a context that is a little scary when it comes to these issues, maybe more than a little, maybe like terrifying. Um, can you talk to that a little bit, like what it feels like right now in the world?
Absolutely.
In the world?
Absolutely. So the choice to bring our work to a close was a very natural one, that involved a number of different sort of factors and criteria. Our work is entirely funded by extremely generous foundations across the Jewish community. We serve primarily Jewish communal professionals. And the fact is that Jewish communal professionals can't afford to be mega donors, so they aren't. They are generous with sharing their data and their time, but they are not generous with sharing their resources because they don't have them. So funding for this work has always been a struggle. We have really benefited from the generosity of Jewish family foundations, and at the same time, family foundations and feminist foundations. But at the same time, that is unsustainable. And so the work really has not been financially stable from the very beginning, and that we recognized. But I'll say that in a world where we have two competing factors, a post October 7th reality that made really funding anything that was not linked to supporting
Israel.
Israel and
Right.
Gaza in this moment, and the fight against anti Semitism.
Right. I,
made funding our work extremely
right.
difficult,
I hear
and at the
this
same time
everywhere.
holding,
I mean, I hear this
yeah,
everywhere.
and it is not impossible, but it is very difficult. And holding alongside that the awareness that in the United States, 2% of all philanthropic giving goes to organizations that support women and girls.
Right. And just in general, just to
2%.
add to that, is that what we sort of were writing about, which is that gender is always considered like a stuff for later. I mean, I
Yeah.
always in 2014 when there was a war in the 2014 war, the Knesset member Moshe Feiglin responded to Eliza Levy at the time, a big feminist legislator, was proposing a bill having to do with sexual abuse, and she'd been working on it for a long time, sexual harassment, sexual abuse. And Moshe Feiglin said, "This is not the time for fairies and rainbows." Right? We're in the middle of a war. This is not the time for fairies and rainbows, as if to say like anything having to do with gender is some kind of like luxury item that we're not going to deal with
That's
right
right.
now. That's always, and you know, I
That's
I
right.
fall into that trap too. Also, you know, right after October 7th, also like I couldn't also be talking about gender when we were in this like massive survival mode. It took me like months and months to start talking about gender again.
And
And there were a lot of gender issues. There still are a
yes,
zillion gender issues. I was living a very gendered life at the time. Like I was doing my very unpaid mother grandmother duties while the men were going off to war, and I was like looking after lots of, you know, kids and babies, you know, unpaid for months while completely neglecting my paid work, like months, you know. And so, but we couldn't
and
even talk about that. We can't even talk about gender in war, even though war is so gendered. I mean, this is just like the tip of the iceberg, but like gender is so easy to say, like, not now, not now, girls. Don't bother us right now. We're busy with the important things.
but most especially in Israel. And it's a fantastic, terrible fib, but fantastic example. If we look at what happens in countries that lift women into positions of leadership
Yeah.
and their capacity to remain financially healthy and stable and to have stable democratic governments, we understand that if we genuinely believe in financial, economic stability and stability writ large, and if we believe in democracy, then we elect women.
Yeah.
Then we bring women into positions of
Yeah.
power. And we have to start having that conversation in order to prevent those other tragedies from unfolding. One of the really interesting challenges for me was that, and please correct me if I'm getting any of the data wrong. Um, After October 7th, one of the stories that was so easy to lift up and yet suppressed in so many different spaces was the story of the Tatzpaniot, right? The women who were at the Gaza border doing the watching
Yeah.
and observing of what was going on
Yep.
there, and who were literally told, nope,
They were
nope,
told, "We hired you for your
listen,
eyes, not your brains." When the women tried to tell the superiors said, "Your job is not
and
to think. Your job is to look at the screens and we'll do the thinking." Literally, that's what they were. And literally, that's what happened. And why,
right.
you know, so much of their data was ignored. Yes, totally gendered.
and
Unbelievable.
and
My daughter's a
so
Tatsby, by the
totally.
way. My daughter wasn't Tatsby at the time. She wasn't at the Gaza border, but she was part of that whole cohort. And like, oh my God. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
So we understand. I mean, it's to precisely to your point, right? We understand what we need to do. We just can't carry it out, right? We understand that people have a wide variety of skills and that we should use them to our best communal advantage, but we still fall into the trap of believing that men can do this
Yeah.
and women can do that. And until we lift ourselves away from that, we are going to fall into the same
Yep.
cycles of powerful men who make decisions that reward them.
Yeah.
And I don't. My interest here is not to suggest that we're all going to end up in the same situation. But part of the reason we're closing is a simple awareness that tides have shifted and that this work is no longer appropriate for this time, right? When we live in a time when
Oh
we are
my
so
God.
highly focused, right? We are so highly focused on preserving and amplifying inequities in our society. We cannot do this work. It's a tragedy.
Mm.
Yes. But the gift that we have, and specifically, that I have, I'm the only professional who does this work. I am the employee of the Gender Equity and Hiring Project. Um, that
Wow.
frankly, we have the benefit of saving for a rainy day, right? We have the
Excuse
benefit
me.
of banking what we do here, um, and believing that if we continue subtly, quietly, carefully doing the work undercover, that we build toward a different future.
Oh my God, you're sending us all underground. You're not actually closing. You're going underground and you're pulling us all with you. And you're saying, this is what we have
Sure.
to do now. We're all going to go underground and we're going to like do this work, all of
I
us.
mean, this is about these are habits of mind and practice. These are not just things that we do out in the world. They're about different ways of thinking.
Wow. Wow. Oh my God. Sarah. Wow. Wow. So, last question. How
Yeah.
are you? You want to tell us a little bit about you, Sarah, and
Hey,
how you
how are
are with
you?
all this? And
Look, we are living through really, really difficult
yeah.
times. This was a hard choice for me, in part because it means that um, I have to grieve the loss of a professional community that I adore, right? I have had the gift and the pleasure of doing this work in an extraordinary community for the last 7 years. Um, I was so lucky to be able to find um, not just a warm reception for the work, but really to find champions, other folks who got out there and really dug deeply into this. We have by the end of our time, we will have close to 250 gender equity advocates who we have trained to be our partners in the work, who will not go underground, but who will continue to do the work in their individual communities and organizations. And at the same time, that is a loss, right? That we don't have the container, the framework for doing this work together. Um, Part of the loss for me is that I am looking for my next professional adventure. I am looking for a job for the first time in many, many years. And that is, something
Shout
new and
out,
challenging as
Sara
well,
Shapiro-Plevan is
right?
awesome, amazing,
Um,
asset, brilliant,
Thank you.
articulate, eloquent, amazing. Yes.
And at the same time, I am certainly aware that as a middle aged white woman
Mm,
looking for a job, I now have to be attentive to all of the things that I needed to capitalize on to serve the folks that I was working with before,
wow.
right? I am now the example of the folks that I served before.
Mm,
And that's a really interesting challenge, right? I celebrate that. And at the same time, it's a challenge. So, where there are opportunities to celebrate, and we will be closing out our work with a big celebration in June. Um, I am aware that every transition is a hard one, and there will be lots of beautiful new beginnings, but that this is a hard moment for folks who do this kind of work here in the United States. And that when we talk about equity, when equity becomes a dirty word, the folks who do this work are also challenged.
right. So, Sarah, I want to say thank you for all your work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great to be in contact with you.
Yeah.